Good morning, everybody. I wanted to talk to you for a little while about the oral literary tradition, especially the Native American oral literary tradition. It is one of the more challenging parts of the course. What you are assigned to read this week is inaccessible in some ways because for most of us it's going to be culturally very, very different from what we're used to. So my remarks today are aimed at helping you get a foothold in this tradition. So let's get started. The first thing I want to mention is that the oral tradition anywhere in the world, and particularly in North America, was anything but a small, minor, out-of-the-way, unimportant kind of literary tradition. It was vast and very significant to the people who lived here prior to contact with Western Europeans. As your textbook well points out, when Columbus came to the New World, there were over 350 different languages spoken in what we now call the United States. It was a very linguistically rich part of the world. And to be unaware of what has been going on in this part of the world prior to contact with Western Europe is something that this course is going to help correct. Okay, so let's begin with just a definition. And by the way, as you listen to the talk, certain words will flash on the screen, and when you see those words, you might want to write those down and add them to our literary terms glossary, which you'll find in the general resource section of our Moodle course. Okay, definition. The tradition of literature in societies without writing systems or societies that have relatively few literate members is known as the oral literary tradition. Now, some societies, even in the United States, did have forms of writing, but for the most part, tribal-level societies in the geographic area we now know as the United States did not have writing. Their literature was shared by way of the voice. One common feature of oral literature amongst most North American tribes was that it was not merely storytelling, but performance. It was a verbal art that bridged speech, chant, and song. Unlike the literary tradition of mainstream American culture today, works from the Native American oral literary tradition are usually marked by anonymous authorship. That is, we don't know who originally created these stories. They may perhaps be better understood as having been created and recreated by thousands of members of societies down through many generations for as long as tens of thousands of years. Stories, songs, and poems grew out of myths that had been told for centuries by many, many thousands of people. Because there was no solitary author, or copyrights, or books that duplicated the exact original words of an original writer, there was a dynamic relationship between conservation, on the one hand, that is, preservation of the basic elements of a story, and innovation, or improvisation, that is, the enhancements brought to a given work by generations of storyteller performers. Indeed, it was innovation that made the role of the individual performer very highly regarded among tribal societies. Everybody loved the storyteller. Performers used inflection, variation of story elements, gestures, silences, and so forth to make old stories new. We can see in some cases how new and striking experiences of a tribe were registered in their stories, even though those stories had been told for generations. For example, the appearance of Europeans in the New World caused some Native American storytellers to incorporate this significant event into traditional stories. In contrast, there are some parts of the Native American oral literary tradition, notably those in the southwestern part of what is now the United States, who had a different view about innovation in their oral literary tradition, particularly when speech was ceremonial in nature. Then Then these stories and poems and chants and songs had to be memorized word for word exactly like they had been handed down generation after generation. It was very important to say them exactly right, because if you did, then it would have a supernatural effect on the tribe and on the environment. So, let's talk about the chief themes that we see amongst stories in the oral tradition. Three kinds come to mind. First of all, there are subsistence stories. That is, stories about planting, stories about hunting, stories about fishing, and so on. How we make a living, how we find the food and things in the world that we need to continue our lives. A second large cluster of stories might be referred to as life crisis stories. If you've taken an anthropology course, you know that a life crisis from a sociological point of view is not necessarily a bad thing. It could be, but it isn't always. Life crisis stories refer to events like birth, marriage, puberty, and death. And then a third major category, and one that we'll be taking a closer look at this week, are origin stories. Stories about where a people came from originally. Among origin stories, there are some subcategories. Experts have identified two major types of origin stories, and these occur again and again across many different cultures in North America. The first kind of origin story is known as an emergence story, and the second kind as an earth diver story. Each of these explains the origin of a people or a tribe. Stories that portray the first humans as moving from darkness to light, from chaos to order, are emergence kinds of origin stories. For example, your assigned reading, Talk Concerning the First Beginning, is clearly an emergence story. Usually Native American emergence stories do not present a proto-world like the Garden of Eden that appears in the book of Genesis, but that story you could probably still consider as an emergence kind of story, even though it is not Native American in origin. In the Native American tradition, emergence stories tended to view Mother Earth as a womb, and human beings first arise out of this earth and they meet their father, which is the light or the sun. Earth diver stories, by contrast, usually have either a deity or the first proto-human coming out of the sky and landing on the earth, or landing on or in the ocean, into the water. If you perform a compare-contrast analysis of these stories, you will find it's a great way to figure out what their underlying meaning or significance might be. For example, if you compare and contrast the story of creation in the book of Genesis with Native American origin stories, you will discover a number of very profound and revealing cultural differences in the way these peoples looked at the world and at themselves. Let me list some of those differences for you right now, and then you can apply these thoughts as you read and write in your journal space about them. First of all, Native Americans did not always believe in a single creator deity the way Christian Europeans did. Second, Native Americans did not view humans as being radically different from animals or even plants and trees. Third, Native Americans saw animal life as intelligent, self-willed, and communicative. It was not, as one might gather from Genesis, subservient to the needs and interests of human beings. 4. Native Americans believed that the best relationship between humanity and the earth was one of respect because of the common origin. We came from the earth, and therefore we must respect the earth. 5. Native Americans had no belief in anything that would be analogous to an enduring original sin or fall from grace. and thus they did not have a concept of nature being out of harmony or out of balance, at least not until white Europeans arrived on the scene. 6. Native Americans moved, in their mythological view, they moved from darkness to light, whereas in the biblical view, we could generally say that humanity fell from grace into a life of suffering, darkness, and sin. And finally, 7, Native Americans viewed the passing of time as generally cyclical in nature. That is, time moved in circles, whereas Europeans tended to view the passage of time as progressing in a linear way. That is, there was the past, it came into the present, and evolved into the future. Such differences of worldviews had and continue to have troubling implications for the way in which cultures relate to one another. If you think and write in your journal space on Moodle this week about these differences in the worldviews you see in Genesis and Native American origin stories, then I think you will discover that it's not so hard to understand why it is that Native Americans and white Europeans had so much trouble when they met each other, especially in the 19th century. Some of that trouble continues today. And now I'd like to make some remarks about what makes reading these samples of the Native American oral literary tradition difficult or challenging. First of all, it's those different worldviews. So if a culture creates a work of literature based on a particular worldview, all these assumptions go unspoken because everybody within the culture already has those assumptions, so there's no need to spell them out. And so actions and thoughts, behaviors on the part of characters in these stories may not make sense to us as readers if we have no knowledge of what those cultural assumptions originally were. And then there's the problem of translation. When any language is translated into another one, inaccuracies and distorted meanings are inevitable and unavoidable. Unless we are native speakers of the original language, therefore, we cannot be certain that we have grasped the real meaning of the original text. Next, as mentioned earlier, the simple fact that the oral tradition has been transcribed into books, into our course anthology, it's printed in a book for us, we cannot really perceive or truly appreciate the actual intended environment of the oral tradition or the performance nature of it. In some cases, native storytellers conveyed parts of their stories with gestures alone. I remember as a student of anthropology, I was reading a book about a storyteller. This happened to be amongst a tribe in northern Mexico. And everybody who was listening to the story had already heard the story, just as we like hearing, as children, we like hearing the story of Little Red Riding Hood over and over. Even though we know the story, we want to be told the story again. So these people are being told a story they know. And at a certain point, the elder who was telling the story made a gesture like this, where he drew back an imaginary bow and let it fly in order to suggest the part of the story where a hunter was trying to take down a deer. Well, he didn't need to say anything because everyone knew the story so well. But that kind of thing would be left out of a transcription of the oral tradition. You wouldn't have it in your anthology, and so it would feel like there's a hole or something missing from what you're reading. So these things can happen. When such stories are transcribed and put into a book, you may miss important cultural assumptions or literary references or literary allusions. Then again, as readers rather than listeners of these stories, we can't deliver feedback to the original storyteller or performer. In the original context, native audiences often were very participatory in the telling of a story, giving constant feedback to the performer to let him or her know what was working and what wasn't working. This kind of feedback surely had a strong effect on the performer's subsequent choices of interpretation, gesture, inflection, and improvisation. In other words, the audience ensured that the original tradition was alive. By contrast, printed transcription is like a single fossilized instance of a living oral tradition work. So, what can we do about these various challenges as readers? How can we mitigate or meet that challenge? There are a few things we can do. Mainly this has to do with adjusting what our readerly expectations are. So when you read these things, you do not want to come at them with the same set of expectations that you would come to an ordinary novel that you buy at the bookstore. You have to change your expectations, and that's part of growing. That's part of what a course like this teaches you. So first, if you notice allusions to things in a story and you don't know what it's really all about, don't worry about it. Rather than being frustrated or irritated by it, simply note it. Note that some of these references must remain opaque to you because you are not a member of the culture that produced that work in the first place. It's okay. There are still many things that you can get from the story. And even though you may not know what a particular reference is about, it is sometimes possible to make interpretations anyway based on things like symbols. The symbolic value of certain elements of the story may reveal meaning that isn't explicitly stated. It is well known that cultures all over the world share a great many symbols for archetypal elements of the human experience. That is, things that are common to all human beings throughout time and space have often been represented symbolically by the same kinds of things. The concept of wholeness, for example, which human beings everywhere throughout time and space recognize, is very often represented by a circle or by the sun. So sometimes an image in a story may convey what the underlying significance is. You will also notice what may appear to be strange views about the way time passes, as I mentioned before. So rather than trying to come up with a complex explanation for some strange abrogation of the passing of time, simply note that the native view of time was often much more flexible, much more subjective, much more cyclical often than is the traditional mainstream American or Western view of the nature of time. Next, as you read, try to imagine that you're hearing the story around a campfire. We've all had that experience. Usually we tell ghost stories. But imagine that a tribal elder is telling the story of the origin of your people around the campfire, and you and your friends are sitting there rapt with attention, listening to this story unfold before your eyes. Pay attention to what you imagine would be the performer's theatrics, the gestures, the inflections, the changes in tone of voice, and so on. This will help you a little bit as you try to recreate the literary experience of the Americans that were the first natives to this part of the world. Finally, as you reread the assigned works this week, try to reflect in your journal space online how you compare the native view of things with your own or your own culture's view of things. For example, what are the differences in the ways you and Native Americans viewed something like the nature of time, or human nature, or non-human nature, or the environment? What about differences in human relationships, especially with regard to age, or gender, or marital status? What about differences between concepts of like justice, or truth, or loyalty? Think about those things as you read these stories. Writing them out in your journal, you may suddenly discover that you don't necessarily agree with either your own culture's view or the view that appears to be expressed in what you're reading. Maybe you have your own individual view. Write about that. When you begin to see how Native American oral tradition works helped Native Americans understand themselves and their world, then it's easier to understand why it's so important for us to read these works. If you have any questions, please post them to this week's discussion forum. I look forward to hearing from you. Thanks.